Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. It's February 21st, 2026, and we're going to be continuing soon with the next installment in our series on Lenin, on the problems with the communist handling of the labor unions under Trotsky's leadership in 1920, early 1921. But first, I wanted to do a quick video about the criticism that Zohran Mamdani has been facing about the New York City budget for this year. Last year I did a series of videos, which I'll link to in the video description, from a Marxist perspective on the likely shortcomings that we would see from a Mamdani administration. Turns out, it only took about 6 weeks before some of these would start showing up. I was on Blue Sky the other day when I caught this thread from Bright D Limm at bdlim2ms.bsky.social discussing the situation, quoting a post by Reuven Blau, who wrote a piece titled "Mamdani Promised a New Era for Parks and Libraries. His First Budget Falls Short. The new mayor pledged to dedicate 1% of the city budget to parks and 0.5% to libraries. His preliminary spending plan delivers less." We're going to read that article in just a minute. First, reading Blau's post, New York City parks go from 0.57% of budget to a projected drop to 0.46% by 2030. New York City libraries coming in at 0.39% of the expense budget versus the 0.5% pledge. Mayor Mamdani's first budget leaves big gaps between campaign promises and spending reality. With a link to the article, looking at Bright D Limm's thread, first post, proposed cuts to libraries, parks, City University of New York, housing and health while keeping New York Police, NYPD, and corrections intact. Proposed real property tax increases disproportionately affecting black owners and most tenants, and homeless encampment sweeps. Why is Mamdani proposing these regressive measures, and how best can we respond? And I should add that Bright D Limm's bio says that they're a member of the New York Working Families Party and New York City DSA. Looks like also a member of the Socialist Majority Caucus in DSA, which has as points of unity, number 1, we believe in the democratic road to socialist revolution, unquote, which historically speaking has never existed, and theoretically speaking, there are good reasons why we would never expect it to exist. And 5, quote, the only viable strategy to build a party in the US at present is through using the Democratic ballot line, unquote. However, the capitalist class completely controls the Democratic Party down to the local level, so I don't know how they actually expect to do that. Anyway, that noted, we are going to come back to Bright D Limm's thread, which is pretty thorough and a fair guide to navigating this topic. However, let's first read Reuven Blau's article, Mamdani Promised a New Era for Parks and Libraries. His First Budget Falls Short. This was published at thecity.nyc, dateline February 19. Mayor Zohran Mamdani rode into office on a wave of progressive promises, including pledges to boost funding for parks and public libraries. And just a quick comment from me about the importance of libraries. Of course, we value them because of all the books and other media that they house and make available to people at no cost. But additionally, libraries are vital hubs of service provision, hosting programs, and otherwise connecting people who don't have a lot of money with resources they probably wouldn't be able to get elsewhere, and generally helping them to navigate their life. People often ask me where they should start with socialist organizing. Number 1 is you need to read. That's why we do so many audiobooks on the channel, and put together recommended reading playlists like the Basic Marxism-Leninism Study Guide, which you can find by going to the home tab on the YouTube, then just scrolling down a little bit. Number 2 is join a Marxist group, even a small book club, and if there's nothing in your area, get involved in some kind of big tent left group. Even if it isn't Marxist like a DSA or Green Party, that will at least help you to meet people, and odds are you can find at least 2 or 3 other people that you can start some kind of a more radical study group with. However, there are even some people who don't have something like that readily available. You can at least volunteer at the library. You'd be surprised by some of the opportunities that's going to give you for getting involved in your community and finding out what are the problems there, which can give you information that will help you to agitate, educate, and organize in the future. Libraries are vitally important. Continuing the article. But Mamdani's first major spending plan falls short on both fronts, raising early questions about when or whether those campaign commitments will materialize. The preliminary budget released Tuesday keeps funding for the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation essentially flat, at roughly half of the 1% of the total budget that Mamdani had pledged. At the same time, spending for the city's library systems comes in below the 0.5% benchmark advocates sought and Mamdani endorsed on the campaign trail, landing at about 0.39% of the budget instead. Library funding has long been subject to what advocates describe as a recurring budget dance, with mayors proposing cuts or inadequate increases before restorations are negotiated later. Mamdani had pledged to break that cycle, including reiterating his support for the 0.5% target at a December appearance at a New York Public Library branch. Comment, this was before he was sworn in. Continuing. For parks, the gap is even more pronounced. The financial plan shows parks funding hovering around 0.5% of total city spending through fiscal year 2030, almost exactly where it has been in recent years. Still, most major park advocates are not publicly criticizing the mayor, and some say they remain hopeful that he will ultimately deliver. The final spending plan must be approved by the city council by the start of the fiscal year, July 1st. Quote, "We recognize this is an early step in a challenging budget year, and we appreciate the mayor's ambitious vision for our city," said Heather Lubov, executive director of the City Parks Foundation. She noted the mayor has vowed to boost the Parks Department budget and added that the activists look forward to working with his administration and the city council, quote, to achieve that goal. Representatives for the mayor did not immediately respond to an email seeking comment. In fiscal year 2026, the Parks Department would receive about $709.9 million out of a $124.6 billion budget, or 0.5%, according to the preliminary budget. By 2030, parks funding drops to roughly $653.6 million against a projected $142.1 billion city budget, or about 0.46%. Reaching the 1% target would require hundreds of millions more annually. The gap grows from roughly $536 million in 2026 to nearly $767 million by 2030, according to figures from the city's preliminary financial plan. During the campaign, Mamdani repeatedly invoked the 1% goal as both a policy commitment and a symbol, arguing that parks, long treated as an afterthought inside the sprawling city budget, deserved parity with other core services. He framed the proposal as a matter of equity and public health, saying that neighborhoods should not have to rely on private conservancies to maintain basic conditions. More recently, last month, he touted the city's parks when announcing Tricia Shimamura as his commissioner to lead the Green Space Agency. Quote, "In a city where almost everything costs something, our parks are not only a sanctuary from the hustle and bustle," Mamdani told reporters, "they are also the rare corner of our city that are truly accessible and affordable to each and every person who calls the city home." Unquote. That's the end of the story, and I'll just add that there are studies showing that people who live in urban areas rank their quality of life significantly higher even when there are trees planted on their city street. Having access to natural plant life and parks is super important. We humans are capable of using all kinds of high technology. However, our connection to nature must not be overlooked. Even just spending a little bit of time every day outside of a purely concrete environment can lower stress and again improve our perceptions of quality of life. Now back to Bright D Limm's thread about the politics going on. Why is Mamdani doing this? First, on why Mamdani's currently proposing a regressive budget. The short answer is that Governor Hochul holds the cards. Kathy Hochul has refused to raise taxes on the rich, leaving Mamdani with only one real option for raising revenue, real property taxes. Now, commenting to jump in there, and I did ask Bright D Limm this on Blue Sky, I said, well, wait a minute. You said that there's only one option for raising revenue, but you also said that he was keeping the NYPD and corrections intact. So, yes, to bring in brand new revenue, or in other words, increase the total income coming into the city, they could increase the real property taxes. However, they could also just distribute the existing money that they have differently. For example, cut the police budget. That wouldn't be an obstacle-free approach, but it is an approach. Continuing. You might ask, didn't Mamdani squander his leverage over Hochul? Bright D Limm continues, yes and no. And commenting on the background there, in case you're out of the loop, top Democrats were very reluctant to give any kind of support to Mamdani. However, Governor Hochul got behind him fairly quickly, probably to pull him to the right to make sure that no change actually occurs, but did do that nonetheless, trying to ingratiate herself with this quote-unquote progressive administration. So, how did the Mamdani administration, or earlier the Mamdani campaign, respond to this? Did they keep sufficient distance? Did they maintain political leverage? Bright D Limm says, well, they did and they didn't. Continuing, on the yes side, Mamdani should have waited to endorse Hochul until after the state budget was signed. In that sense, he squandered his leverage, and commenting, I don't know what to say at this point. You still believe in these people? For those of you who do, you look at a move like that, what can you possibly say to defend that? Well, anyway, Bright D Limm continues, but also on the no side, Mamdani's lever was only one of several available to the left to try to force Hochul's hand. Working Families Party and DSA also squandered their leverage by not waging a gubernatorial primary, so they could have run somebody against her from the quote-unquote left. I mean, relative to her, it's not that hard to find somebody to the left of Kathy Hochul. On the other hand, somebody to the left of Kathy Hochul is not necessarily on what we would call the left, generally speaking, which begins at anti-capitalism. So I wouldn't really phrase this as yes and no. It's more like yes and yes. Mamdani did squander his leverage, and also Working Families Party and DSA squandered theirs. So I don't really see the no there. By the way, some people ask about Working Families Party. Are they a valid left party? I would say no. In practice, they're usually a front for the Democratic Party, even more so than DSA. They sometimes run their own candidates. However, they often just endorse the Democratic Party candidate and not even the quote-unquote progressive ones. Continuing, the governor divided and conquered the left. Although counterpoint, how much effort did she really have to put into that? Alternatively, you might accurately rephrase that as that the quote-unquote left here, by which again we're talking about a pretty opportunist DSA, running candidates in the Democratic Party, were so short-sightedly excited about getting Mamdani in that they effectively rolled over for Hochul, dropping any real resistance. Continuing, because Hochul no longer faces a threat to re-election from the left, she has little reason to budge on the state budget. Now, Mamdani must sing Hochul's neoliberal song by proposing cuts just to balance New York City's budget. That's why Mamdani's preliminary budget sucks, and I would add to that, the overall strategy here used sucks. I mean, assuming that the people behind Mamdani are some kind of sincere social democrats, they needed a bigger strategy. You've got Hochul as a factor here in an election year. Is she going to cut taxes? Especially if you're not putting any pressure on her. I mean, even if you are, it would have to be a lot of really well-chosen pressure to get her to do that. And if that's a vital part of your plan because you don't want to take on the NYPD budget in your first few months of your administration, which to a certain extent is understandable if you don't have a grander strategy for that, which you know goddamn well they don't, then I would say that despite the fact that they managed to get themselves elected running against some complete scumbags, they seem to be failing a lot of major strategic political tests as far as navigating their party. Either that or they just don't care. Continuing the thread, that's the budget cuts in a nutshell. Now, a word about the reviving of homeless encampment sweeps. Everyone knows Mamdani's personally opposed to doing this, so that raises the question, why is he still doing it? In short, to try to maintain a fragile peace with NYPD and the billionaire business class. Comment, these are forces that you have left in place taking the democratic path. They are not going to participate in a robust peace agreement with you. They demand subservience. They demand obedience. What are you going to do? What's your plan to respond? Continuing, let me emphasize what seems like a very obvious point. It isn't Mamdani's fault that the NYPD and the billionaire class, and again, these are capitalists. It's, referring to them as the billionaire class makes this out to just be like the level of money. That's not really the way it works. I get what he's saying. It's the very rich, but we need to do a better job of educating people. Anyway, want to crush or at least control him. And commenting why? Because their class rules society. They created and maintain control over the government and all the other important social institutions, which are stamped with that capitalist class character. We remember that the state is a product of divided class society, and it exists because a ruling class needs mechanisms to oppress and exploit the rest of the population, the other classes in the population. Continuing, I note this because when considering what Mamdani might have done better, we must remember our side has only a few moves we can make. They have more. Now, commenting, I don't even know what to do with this. It seems like why would you follow this? These people have no real idea of how to get and maintain power and then crush their class enemies. The entire approach is so self-limiting. Anyway, continuing, to the extent that Mamdani had some leverage he didn't utilize, I think it was not engaging in a public fight with NYPD, i.e. by retaining Tish. This is a reference to Jessica Tish, the NYPD commissioner. She has been in that role since November 2024, and Mamdani agreed to keep her on in what has been widely perceived as a concession to some of the worst reactionaries within New York City. So not a great start. Kind of looks like you are deliberately selling out or have absolutely no plan and are now flailing, having actually taken office and having to do something. Again, this is why in Marxism you have to build a movement in a fundamentally different way to prepare for the counter-revolution, to deal with the reactionaries, etc. Continuing, by brokering this fragile, or we might say one-way, truce with NYPD and the billionaire-owned corporate conglomerate lobby, Mamdani functionally gave NYPD license to maintain its status quo. I definitely agree. Continuing, was this truce an unforced error? On this matter, I lack enough inside intel to opine with confidence, but if I had to guess, I'd say yes, for I think the public would have backed him in such a fight. And commenting, I would say that the fact that we lack that intelligence, or information we might say, is another failure on Mamdani's part, because why are you not making these things public if that's who you're ultimately trying to serve and to draw from for your power? By not making these things public, it is effectively making it a secret deal that you made with the existing NYPD commissioner. Continuing, in any case, here's the upshot. Mamdani currently lacks the power to neutralize NYPD and the billionaires. I provide this assessment in order to suggest a course of action. Let us still fight hard against austerity for the many, maintenance of the prison industrial complex, racially disparate impact and taxation, and homeless sweeps. But as we do so, let us also be clear in distinguishing our targets, comment for influence, I guess, from our enemies. So he's about to explain this in more detail, but I think that's a really weird framing. By calling Mamdani a target for our influence, it's saying that he is not of the socialist movement, but just something to be influenced by the socialist movement. This is the kind of thinking that you hear a lot from people promoting the false hope in getting the Democratic Party to do what you want. It's basically, we can pull them to the left kind of thinking. So basically, by this logic, you would want to primary the Democrats who you quote unquote can't pull to the left, and then get into power Democrats who you can pull to the left. Or in other words, make a successful target of your influence rather than somebody that you're not going to be able to target successfully with your influence. That kind of logic does not imply that the movement has taken power. Rather, it implies that they have elected someone or put someone in power whom they think that they can control. Now, I think that it's a very safe bet to say that that is not the case, and this entire framing of distinguishing targets from enemies is a fundamentally corrupted compromise. And while life is full of compromises to a certain extent, if we want to see things actually change, we need to aim higher than this particular kind of compromise, where from the start, your theory of taking power doesn't actually involve taking power. Continuing. When it comes to opposing cuts to the good things in the city budget and opposing homeless encampment sweeps, Mamdani is our target. But our enemies are the billionaires and centimillionaires who control electeds like Hochul. Let us take care to weave this distinction into our strategies and messaging, so get ready. New York City Plan, or Public Library Action Network, is waging an essential fight to make Mamdani keep his campaign promise regarding the public library's budget. NYC Plan is right to identify Mamdani as the primary target and the council as secondary ones. On city matters, we must direct our pressure toward these actors. Comment. That is true. I mean, in the sense that they're the people who make the relevant decisions and might be swayed by that kind of pressure. But the larger point here is I thought this guy was supposed to be a socialist. I mean, that's what you all said, that's what he said, etc. As we communists were saying, he doesn't talk about capitalism, he doesn't talk about private property, private profit, as a system that needs to be broken so that we can initiate the building of socialism in its place, does not put out a comprehensive plan for breaking down the existing capitalist infrastructure and building new infrastructure to replace it. You know, the basic thing that socialists have always done. And instead, you're dealing with a guy who promised this and that and is already letting the budget slide in the first 2 months of being in office. I have a feeling that the results are going to be profoundly underwhelming, but let's say for a minute that this is just sort of a rough start and he's just getting his bearings and they're going to drop the main plan sometime later. I sincerely doubt it, but again, you want to question getting involved with socialist strategies, socialist in air quotes here, that basically revolve around pulling elected Democrats to the left. That doesn't have anything to do with socialism whatsoever, and the results are likely to be very underwhelming, even by reformist social democratic standards. Continuing the thread, but for the sake of keeping in mind the larger power map and knowing where to direct most of our justified anger, let us be disciplined. As public advocate Jumaine Williams rightly notes, let us remember that none of this would likely have happened had Hochul not opposed tax the rich. Comment, stop it. Really. I mean, what else do you expect at this point? She is a clearly right-wing politician. Forget the party. She is a right-wing politician. We're living in a time where ICE is staging paramilitary occupations, kidnapping people off the street, and shooting them dead in the street. This is on top of crippling austerity and a cost of living crisis, and this is with the tacit support, and sometimes not even tacit support, of the pseudo-opposition party, the Democrats, the actually fascist collaborating Democratic Party. Do you really think that she's not going to oppose tax the rich, especially in an election year? And this raises so many other profound questions. There's really a can of worms behind that question. It speaks to what are the goals of this administration and the movement behind the administration and the movement to put similar candidates in office around the country in the name of quote-unquote socialism, which this isn't, as previously discussed, but just even leaving that aside for the moment, addressing their goals in their own terms, how are they planning to achieve these? So if the plan hinges on getting Hochul to raise taxes, what is the strategy for getting that done? Because it seems like there is predictable massive opposition to that happening. Obviously, her political donors, but also just the timing of the whole situation. Was that factored in? If not, as I said before, this is a major failure of political strategy, even to achieve social democratic reformist goals. But actually, I feel like there might even be a different goal here in mind, which is not even to get those done. They might not even think that they can achieve those goals, and they might have set the bar so low that it's just to be able to point to Hochul as stalling progress. You think people don't know that already? Sorry to yell, but if that's the case, which it kind of looks like that is a plausible scenario to me, this is just giving the runaround to the working class base that put Mamdani in to get something out, at least in the form of better public services, let alone the whole question of building a political movement. I submit that no one is really going to be satisfied by a bunch of supposed progressives just pointing a finger at a right-wing Democrat and saying, but she's obstructing us. Yeah, we know, dipshit. That's been the case for decades. Any progressive-minded person who's been following the news at all already knows that, and I have a feeling that people aren't going to be real satisfied with that kind of excuse for long. The whole point is to elevate people who can provide political leadership to the movement to make advances and eventually win, not to make excuses for not having a goddamn plan. So all of these questions point to something really sketchy going on, and no matter which actual proportion and balance of reasons for this happening it isn't good. Continuing the thread, though Hochul no longer has a primary challenger, we can still help construct a political majority to tax the rich this year by winning our assembly primaries. Again, socialism is not when you tax the rich. Continuing, by shifting the assembly's political center of gravity this year, will improve tax the rich's chances of success next year. And I guess we see the political majority slogan again. That's that caucus. I assume that this is their main strategic plank, and it's a very limp one. In sum, 1. Fight the proposed NYC budget cuts. 2. Oppose the sweeps. 3. Identify Mamdani as the primary target, I guess, of influence and pressure. 4. ID the council as secondary targets. 5. ID Hochul as the direct cause of the cuts. 6. Help our assembly challengers win, or elect better Democrats. 7. Apportion your anger at Mamdani in proportion to the degree of power he actually has. Wow. I mean, true in a sense, he's not responsible for what goes on in every single political seat in New York City or New York State, but that's not the only context in which people should be evaluating him. And not just him personally, but this entire strategy, the socialist movement in general, should be evaluating, does what these people are proposing, these opportunists, does this kind of opportunism and this whole democratic socialist movement work at all? What can it do? And under what circumstances, and what can't it do and why? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? What are the pitfalls to look out for? So I think apportioning anger at Mamdani in proportion to the degree of power he actually has makes sense as far as evaluating his performance as mayor, but that's not the only evaluation. There is also an evaluation at play, which is Mamdani being evaluated as a self-styled representative of a burgeoning socialist movement. the limitations of so-called democratic socialism, which tends to refer to one of two things, either to people who think that capitalism is basically fine but should have more public services, or to people who actually believe in uprooting capitalism, but by gradualist, reformist changes to the existing capitalist state. It's still very early in the Mamdani administration. However, there is already a lot of concern on social media, and not just among communist circles, that Mamdani may be neither of these, just another bog-standard Democrat.